7, this one is on neuroplasticity, the idea that our brain, its anatomy, its physiology, its working, its synapses, its neurons change either throughout life or during childhood. We'll go through the different lines of evidence and ideas that we've got here. So old-fashioned idea, last century's idea, was that after a phase in early childhood, nothing really changes. Neurons and pathways are laid down in the way that they will function throughout life. This idea has been discredited based on lots of different evidence. So therefore, we now have a more modern idea, more modern concept of, yes, childhood is an intense phase. However, experiences throughout life can change the brain's anatomy, as well as the organizational functioning, as well as how different neurons speak to each other, how synapses are strengthened, and so on. And yes, it is a normal, natural occurrence in the healthy development and learning of language, learning all sorts of memories that you build up during your life based on your experiences. Now, the evidence that we've got, one line of evidence is that if you've got someone who had a stroke and connections have been damaged, areas have been damaged, that reconnecting does seem to be possible to some extent. This does not mean that someone who is paralyzed because their entire spinal cord has been severed, they can magically heal themselves from one second to the other, no. But there seem to be some neuronal connections and some neurons that can reshape and rethink and reorganize themselves. I've watched a really exciting documentary. I haven't found the link to this yet. I'm going to try to find it again. It was a documentary of a male who has been paralyzed completely after a stroke and was just literally bedbound, not able to move their head even, and was able to still speak and communicate through that. But he, when thinking about moving, managed to make himself move, or dreaming or kind of imagining himself moving, made himself move again. So kind of somehow avoiding the damaged areas of his brain, and somehow it regained function in most of his body again, eventually even being able to walk. So quite a miracle that there was a trick in which way he managed to, in his particular stroke situation, managed to get around that damage. Okay, neuroplasticity comes in 2 different versions. One is synaptic, so literally just a connection between 2 neurons, and the other one is actually the neuron itself. Let's look at the first one here, the synaptic neuroplasticity. The more you use it, the more it's going to strengthen that pathway, is literally in a nutshell. Either more or less neurotransmitter is built up in synapses that are being strengthened, the more or less receptors are being available on the postsynaptic cell, the frequency of neurotransmissions being received by the postsynaptic cell. All this has a major role in memory and learning and settling down permanent information. So pathways that are being used are being strengthened, and from the synaptic neuroplasticity, strengthen those synapses. The other one is the idea, and it has been evidence, it has been shown that axons can reform dendrites, new connections can be formed between dendrites and axon terminal somewhere else. The cell body can change. The voltage gated channels, and therefore strengthening, let's say, calcium inflow out of synapse, for example, that can change. And there is a link to injury, so that those cell changes happen if injury, either through trauma or through a stroke, that is triggering that non-synaptic neuroplasticity. Childhood, it's literally a being born with millions of neurons, with a limited number of synapses, and then losing your neurons. It sounds a little bit like, what is going on? However, those neurons are forming new connections and more connections. So it's kind of a losing, but the ones you keep are the ones that make sense and can do something for you. So as the child ages, you're getting more and more synapses, completely overshooting, going from 2,500 into 15,000 synapses. So you've lost a few neurons, but the number of synapses you've produced has gone insane. some of those synapses seem to not produce anything meaningful, seem to produce some random pathways that when used are not leading to anything useful. So during growing up, and particularly during adolescence, during your teenage years, the synapses that are being used regularly, let's say the handwriting ones, the speech ones, the how to play a violin ones, that becomes hardwired. These pathways become permanent, they become efficient, and other synaptic pathways are just being pruned out, just being, cut, you don't need them. However, that pruning continues throughout your life. So you can continue to lose, and you will continue to lose synapses as well as neurons, but it's the synapses that really seem to do that neuroplasticity. So by adulthood, you've got fewer synapses, but the ones that have been strengthened to become permanent, they seem to be the meaningful ones, the learned things, the experienced and memorized things. Language, the development of language has got a relatively short window. The vast majority of babies start to babble and produce some sort of word noises, sort of noises that can be misinterpreted by about 7 months. You can find out whether a child or baby has got a hearing problem much earlier if they don't respond to any noise. Let's say they've got a loud noise in the room and they don't shock up, and you can not see any response in their body to that loud noise. So you can detect hearing loss in a baby much earlier, but the speech development usually happens or starts to blah 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 blah, starts by 7 months. Now deaf babies or partially hearing impaired babies develop their speech much slower, and they will find alternatives. They will find gesturing, they'll learn signing. There's also a lot of evidence that babies learn to sign even before they can speak. So that's for you that go into child development. That might be an interesting one to look at. Also evidence from babies with ear infections, delayed onset of language development. There's one particular case that's mentioned in your textbook and in your syllabus. I found the links here to the particular Guardian article. If you wanted to follow that, just go to the normal PowerPoint and look it up there or search it yourself. There was a girl that has been completely isolated without language development or access to any way of speaking to somebody. Was 13 when she was found, and even afterwards with the most intensive training to try to get her to speak, to try to get her communicating verbally, it was just not going to happen. The development window seems to have been shut off at that point. So for speech development, there seems to be a cut off to that window of being able to develop speech. Now, there's some evidence that actually before birth already, a fetus will respond to sounds, to being spoken to. You can do all sorts of investigations. This one here, actually, the one with the noise cancelling headphones for mum, that is not in your syllabus, but it's an interesting one. You can determine the character, or you can have a look at the character of baby before it's being born. If you put headphones onto mum that completely noise cancel and her experience is taken out of the equation, and play sounds that should be loud enough to hear in the womb, and see if babies respond to those sounds with regards to, do they move, is their heartbeat increasing, are they getting distressed? How good or not good those investigations are is yeah, up to you to make an ethical decision here. But there have been reports of newborns being calmed if they hear the same music that they've heard during pregnancy. A bit of a, right, everything's fine, you hear that music again, you're just like you're in the womb again. There's some anecdotal evidence there as well. Right, speech goes a lot with phonemes. That's our perception of sounds. If it's an R or an E or an U or whatever it is. The evidence, there's an evidence from Japan, when in the Japanese language, you don't make a distinction between an R or an L sound. And if those corresponding synapses are never used as to make a decision, then it's almost as if someone in that upbringing cannot hear the difference and therefore won't be able to produce those different sounds in their mouth because they don't perceive it as two different sounds. And that's about by the age of 2 years. If you've never heard them, it's tricky to ever experience those sounds. Grammar and syntax. So if you're learning a wrong grammar from your parents by the age of 5, if you've never heard anything different in reception or year 1 or year 2 of school, then that's laid down. It's much harder to learn, possible to learn, but it is harder to learn. Again, there seems to be a bit of a neuroplasticity end window to the laying down of grammar. Something sweet and international in all languages that we know. If you speak to a baby, you automatically speak differently. You slow things down and you speak with a bit more, maybe ups and downs in the voice, but a whole lot of high-pitched speech, long vowels, simple sentences. It's also called parentese or motherese. That's sort of how do you babble with a kid? How do you pronounce words really slowly and make it sound interesting? You know, how you'd read to a child. Right, I'll do the genetics bit in a little bit.